Back in September 2021, I analyzed Anthony Fauci's body language during his heated hearings with Senator Rand Paul, and I pointed out that something appeared deeply, undeniably off. Now, fast forward to the present, and Fauci's private daily notes have finally been released to the public, offering us an unprecedented, unguarded baseline that we never had before. When you laid that private paper trail right next to what the man was actually saying into the television cameras, a fascinating, deeply bizarre pattern of human behavior begins to emerge. Around July 24, 2026, Senator Rand Paul, chairman of the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, released Anthony Fauci's personal daily notes from his time running the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, obtained via a good old-fashioned congressional subpoena alongside a companion file of internal NIH and NIAID emails regarding prestigious awards. Now, to be clear, these notes are not a secret teen diary full of heart-shaped doodles. They are an official, handwritten daily record of events, meaning calling them a secret diary is a bit of a sensationalist stretch, though notably, neither Fauci nor his legal team have stepped up to challenge their authenticity. So a private daily record functions as an unguarded psychological baseline because it reveals how a human being frames reality when there are no red camera lights, no eager journalists, and no public performance to manage. So the gaping chasms between these private musings and his public proclamations become the entire focus of this analysis. So the record unfolds in 6 distinct escalating steps, moving from basic questions of personal ego to matters of public candor, scientific judgment, financial entanglements, and ultimate personal incentives. So let's dig into every single one of them. Welcome back, my body language buddies. My name is Jesus Enrique Rosas. I'm the body language guy, and if you want to support my channel, you can hit the usual links down in the description. But right now, let's get down to it. So bit 1 centers on the fascinating contrast between personal fame and an appalling global death toll. On May 21st, 2020, right after jotting down the latest pandemic mortality figures, Fauci penned 3 consecutive stunning sentences in his notes, remarking that his national and international fame was explosive and really unimaginable, declaring without a hint of irony that he was the most famous and talked about person in the country and one of the most recognizable people on the planet. Sort of Andrew Tate, but with hair. And noting that the president seemed enamored with him despite Fauci still in the spotlight. So an earlier entry from April 7, 2020, echoes his exact same fixation, briefly noting that the press remained hot and heavy around him, with multiple stories dropping daily about his personal brand. Now, compare those May 21st self-congratulatory entries with one stark, brutal reality. On that exact same day, COVID-19 had officially claimed over 329,000 lives globally, with the U.S. death toll surpassing 93,000 human beings. So those horrifying body counts do not appear anywhere inside Fauci's self-reflective paragraphs about his soaring stardom. They exist merely as background wallpaper. A stark reality punctuated 2 months later when his fame culminated in a glossy InStyle magazine cover featuring the good doctor lounging poolside in dark sunglasses without a mask. So the private notes detail his sudden ascent to rock star status with intense emotional passion, while the staggering real-time mass mortality event unfolding right outside his window barely registers a blip of that same emotional energy. So that is marking the very first divergence in the record. Now, from questions of personal narcissism, I move to the second bit, the stark difference between private fatality rate estimates and public fear-mongering. On March 11, 2020, Fauci testified before the House Oversight Committee, flatly telling the world that seasonal flu had a 0.1% mortality rate and asserting that COVID-19 was roughly 10 times more lethal than that. Yet, looking back just 5 weeks prior in his private notes on February 8, 2020, following a phone call with Tom Frieden, Fauci casually wrote that the actual fatality rate appeared to be more like 0.2 to 0.3%. Now, to be totally fair and transparent here, on February 28, 20 days after writing that private entry and 11 days before his terrifying congressional testimony, Fauci co-signed a public editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine stating the fatality rate might actually be considerably less than 1%, comparing it to a severe seasonal flu. This means the lower, far less apocalyptic estimate was technically already out there, with his name attached to it. And we have to acknowledge that early epidemiological data was constantly shifting, making it hard to pin down the exact line between case fatality rates and infection fatality rates when nobody even knew the true denominator of infections. The evidence doesn't prove that Fauci secretly held the true master number and maliciously hid it from the public. Rather, what I analyze reveals a fascinating shape-shifting of tone depending entirely on who was listening. In private, you get a cool, calm estimate of 0.2 to 0.3%. In a sober medical journal, you get a cautious middle ground. But on primetime television in front of Congress, you get the absolute maximum fear factor of a disease 10 times deadlier than the flu, exposing a dramatic shift in emotional register between the private baseline and the public performance. So, bit 3 brings us to the bizarre revisionist history of I didn't shut down anything versus his actual documented policy advocacy. On August 23, 2022, Fauci sat down with Neil Cavuto on Fox News and boldly claimed that he didn't shut down a single thing, insisting the historical record would show he and Deborah Birx merely recommended a temporary pause to flatten the curve rather than total economic and social lockdown. Now, this statement is a clever, lawyerly technicality. Fauci did not possess the legal executive power to lock down schools, smash small businesses, or enforce stay-at-home orders, as those heavy-handed police powers belong strictly to governors, mayors, and the White House. However, the hilarious contradiction emerges when you compare his legal hair-splitting with the immense, unprecedented cultural and political influence he wielded to push those exact policies. Because back on March 12, 2020, Fauci explicitly stated that closing schools constitutes mitigation, and throughout the entire crisis, he served as the undisputed, loudest public cheerleader for the exact package of draconian restrictions that force entire states to grind to a total halt. But here's the smoking gun in his own diary, in his own records. He said, I spoke with Bill de Blasio, mayor of New York City, and convinced him, based on what I was saying publicly and my conversation tonight, to close the New York City schools. He had already decided based on what I was saying on TV. I went on to tell him he should close the bars and restaurants in New York City. He said that he would base this on my recommendation. I had a similar call with Ann O'Leary, the COS of Governor Gavin Newsom of California. Ann said that based on my TV appearances today and yesterday, the governor has decided to close the schools in California as well as the bars and restaurants.
I wonder if you would recommend locking down schools if you had to do it all over again.
Well, again, it's first of all, I didn't recommend locking anything down. You're asking me questions. You're talking about the CDC is the public health agency that uses their epidemiologists and their science-based approach to make recommendations.
So the fair view is that he was simply drawing a formal, pedantic boundary between legal authority and advisory influence, which is technically true. But his 2022 media tour conveniently minimized the massive central role he played in pushing society toward those catastrophic shutdowns in the first place. Which brings us to beat 4, where we pivot from personal legacy to the high-stakes controversy over where this virus actually came from. Private doubt regarding the wet market narrative versus public ironclad certainty. So on January 26, 2020, Fauci recorded a remarkably clear, sober assessment in his private notes, explicitly writing that the seafood market was not the source of the outbreak, but merely its amplifier. He went on to state that emerging epidemiological and genomic data indicated the initial human infection occurred way back in early December and was entirely disconnected from the market, an assessment that was completely consistent with early natural spillover theories and supported by research published in The Lancet around that same time. So, no, these specific notes are not a smoking gun confession that the virus escaped a lab, but what they explicitly reveal is deep, fundamental uncertainty. Fauci wrote, "It now appears," and noted that early cases lacked market ties, framing his private views as tentative and open-ended, while his subsequent public messaging painted the natural market origin hypothesis as a rock-solid, unquestionable, settled fact. So the contrast here is not a simple binary of secret lab truth versus public market cover-up. It is a profound manipulation of certainty, where private doors left wide open were publicly slammed shut and deadbolted for the masses. So that provisional private language becomes downright explosive when we examine bit 5. Private discussions of deliberate insertion versus public mockery of conspiracy theories. On February 1st, 2020, Fauci joined a high-level secret teleconference convened by Sir Jeremy Farrar, and Fauci's own notes from that day capture a mind-blowing conversation among elite scientists. He wrote that there was no consensus regarding the likelihood of deliberate genetic insertion, noting that while scientists like Fauci and Drosten argued for a natural origin, the rest of the experts on the call explicitly felt that deliberate lab insertion was a distinct possibility. Fauci even wrote down specific concerns about the Wuhan Institute of Virology, noting that Dr. G. Zensli had spent years conducting gain-of-function research on coronaviruses to adapt spike proteins to human ACE2 receptors, concluding his entry with the ominous heavy line, "We could not let this go." Yet, a mere 8 days later, on February 9, Fauci popped up on Newt Gingrich's podcast and casually dismissed the entire lab origin concept, chuckling that, like all conspiracy theories, they are just conspiracy theories. Now, the existence of that February 1st phone call was already exposed by a FOIA request back in 2023. But what these new notes reveal is Fauci's immediate personal reaction to it, showing that he personally recorded just how deadly serious the lab leak hypothesis was taken behind closed doors. He did not write off the lab leak as madness in his private notes. He acknowledged that a majority of the top scientists on the phone considered engineered insertion a real, terrifying possibility, only to turn around a week later and slander anyone asking the exact same question as a tinfoil hat lunatic. So this directly ties back to the body language analysis I published on September 8, 2021, where I evaluated Fauci's defensive, agitated microexpressions during his confrontations with Rand Paul over reverse genetics and gain-of-function funding. I noted back then that his baseline behavior betrayed massive internal stress and evasiveness, and now these private notes provide the written proof explaining why. In private, the lab origin was a terrifying, unsolved mystery requiring immediate investigation. But in public, it was a dangerous myth to be crushed underfoot. Finally, bit 6 takes us down into the tacky, concrete reality of personal gain. Fauci actively soliciting his own prestigious awards and cash prizes. So, this final set of records doesn't come from his daily thought logs, but rather from a companion release of internal NIH emails documenting a bizarre pattern of self-nomination. On October 10, 2018, Fauci emailed Barton Haynes at Duke University regarding the prestigious Shaw Prize, writing with incredible forwardness that there was another award looking possible for him if Haynes was willing to submit it, adding the telling phrase, "As usual, I will supply all of the material." So, Haynes instantly fired back a cheerful compliance, and over the next 3 years, the paper trail reveals roughly a dozen similar award pursuits. Federal ethics regulations actually blocked Fauci from pocketing the fat cash prizes associated with several of these honors, like the Leonhardt Award, the Vanderbilt Prize, and Georgia Tech Award, because the institutions giving out the cash were direct recipients of massive NIAID federal grants that Fauci himself controlled. He was, however, legally permitted to pocket Israel's Dan David Prize, walking away with a cool $900,000 after a mandatory 10% donation, simply because the money flowed from an overseas foundation rather than a direct grant recipient. So the two words that make your skin crawl in those emails are "as usual," which casually signals a long-standing routine operation where the head of the massive federal agency feeds pre-written nomination packages to scientists whose institutions depend on his agency for survival. So to put that in perspective, Duke-affiliated entities rake in approximately $568 million in NIAID grants during that window, creating a staggering conflict of interest regardless of whether any formal corruption occurred. So this is not an abstract scientific debate anymore. It's a concrete paper trail of ego and institutional leverage sitting right at the end of this sequence to force us to reevaluate every single public narrative through the lens of personal incentive. So what do we have here? 6 clear divergences driving toward one consistent, unsettling conclusion. The private daily record offers us a raw, unvarnished baseline, and against that baseline, Fauci's public persona consistently shifted in the exact same direction every single time. In private, he obsessed over his newfound global celebrity status while the dead stacked up in the background. He shifted his fatality messaging to fit the fear profile of his immediate audience. He dissimulated about his central role in pushing societal lockdowns. He privately harbored deep doubts about the natural market origin while publicly peddling it as absolute truth. He privately treated the lab leak theory as a grave, viable possibility, while publicly mocking it as a conspiracy. And finally, he routinely used his vast institutional power to solicit vanity awards for himself. So yeah, we are witnessing a masterclass in systematic public performance where the priorities presented to the public wildly contradicted the reality recorded in the dark. So when I analyzed his body language back in September 2021 and said something felt deeply off, I was reading the physical leakage of a man managing this massive cognitive dissonance. And today, the written record finally proves it. The private record and the public performance align on only one single truth. They show us precisely what Anthony Fauci cared to protect and what he deemed worthy to elevate: himself. So let me know what you think about this in the comments, and make sure that you download my free 100 body language tips in the description of this video. My name is Jesus Enrique Rosas. I'm the Body Language Guy. Much love and bliss.